The rain had been falling steady for 3 days straight, the kind that didn't crash or pour, but crept into bones like regret. Mud turned the narrow trails around Ash Hollow into slow-sucking traps. The air smelled of cattle, old smoke, and wet cedar. Jonas Whitlow moved like a man, caught between ghosts. His boots squelched in the muck, each step uncertain. He was halfway between the Grady Saloon and nowhere, the latter being his weather-worn ranch, 2 miles south. Whiskey clung to him like sweat, seeping from his pores, dulling the ache behind his ribs. He didn't remember why he stayed so long in town. Maybe he'd tried to forget. Or maybe, like every night, he'd just waited for the ghost of Annalise to come walking out of the bottle. She never did. The storm whispered through the cottonwoods as Jonas staggered off the trail, hand gripping a sagging fence post for balance. Lightning flashed brief and white, throwing the landscape into stark relief. And there, in that flicker, he saw something. A body. He blinked hard. Not a drunk's trick, not this time. A figure slumped beside the road, small, still. Jonas trudged forward, boots slipping in the mire, until he stood over it. It was a boy. No more than 10, maybe 11. Thin, his kindling face caked in mudblood on his lip rope, burns at the wrist. Beside him, another body grown face down in the dirt, the smell of death, thick. Jonas stood frozen. His heart stuttered. Something deep, something old and raw, cracked open inside him. Tennessee, fire, screams. He dropped to one knee. The boy wasn't dead. He looked up, eyes dark wide, alive and afraid. Jonas opened his mouth. Nothing came out at first. His throat was dry despite the rain. You hurt me? The boy didn't speak, didn't blink. Jonas reached to cut the ropes with his pocket knife. The boy flinched but didn't pull away. Easy? I ain't here to harm you. The bindings fell away. The boy flexed his hands. Still no words. Jonas looked at the dead man, bullet through the back, blood mingling with the mud. This was no accident. He looked back at the boy. You got a name. Silence. Jonas sighed. He didn't need this. He didn't want this. But he couldn't walk away. He never forgave himself for walking away before. Come on, let's get you warm. The boy hesitated, then nodded, barely perceptible. Jonas took off his coat, old canvas smelling of horses and wood smoke, and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders. It hung off him like a tarp on a scarecrow. Together they walked into the storm. The ranch was nothing to look at. Sagging fences, a roof that leaked if you looked at it wrong, and a chimney that hadn't pulled smoke right in 2 winters. But it was dry. It was his, and that had to count for something. Jonas set a fire in the hearth, while the boy sat curled on the edge of the rug, dripping and silent. Jonas poured water from the kettle and dropped grounds into the coffee pot. He didn't ask if the boy wanted some. He just poured 2 cups and set one near the child's bare feet. He watched him from the chair, watched the way he didn't look around, the way he sat too still. Jonas took a sip. The coffee was bitter, burnt, just right. I ain't going to ask who that man was, not tonight. No answer. Or why you were tied up. Still nothing. Jonas ran a hand over his stubbled chin. You ever talk? The boy shrugged. That was all. They sat like that for a long time. Fire cracking, wind moaning through the cracks. Jonas thought of Annalise, of her laugh in the kitchen, her hands in the garden. He thought of the last time she smiled, before her lungs turned to blood. He stared into the flames. I used to think drinking would keep the ghosts quiet. Turns out they swim better than I do. The boy didn't respond, but he picked up the coffee. Jonas watched him take a sip. His hand shook, but he didn't spill. You can stay here, just for the night. Another flash of lightning. Jonas caught the flicker of those eyes again. He saw fire in them. Not the kind that burns, the kind that survives. He didn't know the boy's name, didn't know what trouble would come knocking. But for the first time in years, he felt something crack open beneath the weight of the rain and the whiskey and the guilt. It felt like a beginning. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving a damp, heavy silence over Ash Hollow. Jonas Whitlow stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching the sky slowly lift from gray to pale silver. Inside, the boy still slept, curled up near the hearth like a wild fox pup, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled faintly of pipe smoke and cedar. He hadn't said a word. Not since Jonas cut him free and carried him out of that mud-soaked field. No name, no crying. Just those eyes, deep dark and unsettlingly still. Jonas poured water into a dented tin cup, then reached for the whiskey bottle resting near the wash basin. He poured half a glass, brought it to his lips, but stopped. Levi had opened his eyes. They tracked Jonas's every move. Jonas stared into the glass, then back at the boy. For a second he felt as though he were the one under inspection. Exposed. He set the glass down, didn't drink. Saying nothing, he turned away and splashed cold water on his face. By the time Jonas hitched the wagon and rolled into town, Ash Hollow had stirred to life. He meant to buy supplies, maybe ask a few quiet questions, but nothing too loud. He didn't want anyone sniffing around about the boy asleep on his floor. Ash Hollow didn't forgive easily. The general store slouched in the wind, near the center of town. A few old-timers chewed tobacco on the porch, muttering about busted fences and wild dogs. "Did you hear about the gold coach?" one of them asked as Jonas passed by. Jonas froze. "What coach?" "2 nights back down by Devil's Cut. Army shipment headed out of Cheyenne. Ambushed. Drivers dead. 2 soldiers too. 1 body missing. A kid, they say. Half-blood boy. Dark hair." Jonas's heart stuttered. He gave a slow nod and stepped inside the store. Bought flour, beans, tobacco. Kept his mouth shut and ears open. The town was nervous. Not just because of the robbery, but because the suspect was a child, one who may have pulled a trigger. Jonas drove home slower than he came. The sky was lighter, but the wind bit colder. The boy was awake when Jonas came in, sitting up with his knees drawn to his chest, watching him without blinking. "You eaten yet?" Jonas asked. No answer, just a steady gaze. Jonas sighed, dropped the sack of supplies. "Well, you will." He built up the fire, made a pot of beans and salted pork, and set a bowl in front of the boy. The child hesitated only a moment, then ate like someone who hadn't seen a meal in days. No thanks, no hesitation, just hunger. Jonas sat opposite him, arms folded, studying every move. "Where you from?" Silence. "Got a name?" "Still nothing?" "You one of 'em?" Jonas asked low. "From the coach." The boy paused. Just a flicker, a clench of the jaw. Jonas felt something twist inside him. Suspicion, fear, and worse, an aching need to look the other way. He rubbed his face. Damn it! The boy kept eating slower now, warier. Jonas paced the room back and forth. His hand brushed the whiskey glass again. Stopped. He could go to the sheriff. Maybe he was still at the station. Or ride the boy out to Fort Kearney. Or even leave him on the church steps and be done with it. But the truth, sharp as cold tin water, sat in his gut. He wasn't going to, because he knew that look. He'd seen it in the trenches near Vicksburg. In the eyes of a dying captain who begged him to leave and live in his own reflection after every drunken night. It wasn't a child's gaze. It was a survivor's, someone who had walked through fire and still carried the smoke. Jonas picked up the glass, stared at the amber liquid. His hand trembled slightly. He poured it out onto the porch. The boy stood in the doorway, silently watching. That night Jonas talked more than usual. Not to the boy, but near him. About the weather, the horses, an old silver mine. Nothing that mattered, just noise to fend off the silence. The boy sat near the fire, hugging his knees, eyes fixed on the flames. Jonas laid out an extra blanket near him before heading to bed. Didn't say good night, didn't need to. Next morning Jonas woke to the smell of something cooking. Not beans. The boy had found the eggs. He was frying them in the old dented skillet. He didn't speak, but looked up when Jonas entered. Jonas gave a slight nod, sat down, ate. When they finished, the boy gathered the bowls, washed them without being told. Jonas felt something small crack open inside his chest. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and cold. But inside that tiny shack, the fire crackled low, the air warm. And for the first time in years, Jonas didn't feel like he was dying. The boy didn't speak, but he listened. And Jonas, against every old instinct, had begun to listen to himself again. The morning wind bit sharper than usual when Jonas saddled up the mule cart. Levi stood nearby, arms crossed, a scarf wrapped around his wrist, the welt from the rope burn still red and angry. Jonas hadn't said much, only that they had a stop to make. The boy had nodded, wary but obedient. He hadn't spoken a word since arriving, but in that silence there was a kind of understanding growing between them. Thin as wire but strong. They rode into town through the back trail, the wheels creaking over frozen ruts. Jonas kept one hand loosely on the reins, the other resting near his knee. He could feel the old pull of the flask, tucked inside his coat, but he didn't reach for it. Ash Hollow lay half asleep in the early light. The saloon's porch still stank of last night's fights and spilled gin, and the church bell hung silent like a mourner. Jonas guided the cart down past the livery and toward the small whitewashed cottage at the edge of town, Maggie Keene's place. Maggie had been the town's healer ever since Doc Fuller drank himself into an early grave 5 winters back. She was sharp, unsentimental, and had hands steadier than most surgeons. Widow for near 10 years, no children, just a garden, a stovepipe chimney, and a set of eyes that saw too much. Jonas knocked. It took a minute, then the door creaked open. "Well, I'll be," Maggie said, folding her arms. "Thought I'd seen the last of you." "Got a kid needs looking at," Jonas replied. "Rope burn. Might fester." Her eyes flicked to Levi. Then back to Jonas. "Bring him in. Don't track mud." Inside smelled of dried lavender and vinegar. The place hadn't changed. Same glass jars. On the shelves, same wooden table by the window. Jonas stood awkwardly as Maggie guided Levi to sit. She inspected the boy's wrist with clinical care. "This happened in the rain?" she asked. Jonas nodded. "Found him like that." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "You found him?" "Didn't steal him, if that's what you're asking." The corner of her mouth twitched. She cleaned the wound in silence, then wrapped it in fresh linen. Levi didn't flinch, just stared straight ahead, as if memorizing the shape of the window. "You should eat something," she told the boy. "He doesn't talk," Jonas said quietly. "Not yet." Maggie glanced at Jonas. "But he listens. You can tell." Jonas looked away. "He's seen things. Maybe worse than we have." That earned a pause. Then Maggie stepped to the stove, ladled some oatmeal into a bowl, and set it before Levi. He stared at it, unmoving. "Is he yours?" she asked. "No, but you brought him here." Jonas didn't answer. His fingers itched for the flask again, but he didn't reach. Maggie sighed and sat across from him. "I heard about the coach, gold shipment, missing soldier. Word is, the boy's involved." Jonas tensed. "You believe that I believe he's scared. And you look like hell. Been drinking again?" Jonas swallowed, trying not to. "Trying?" He nodded, "Harder than I remember." She looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "You can't save anyone if you're drowning too, Jonas." He didn't answer, but the words sat with him. Levi, meanwhile, had eaten half the oatmeal and was now watching the bookshelf. His eyes had locked on something. Maggie followed his gaze, frowning. That shelf, Jonas stepped closer. Nestled between 2 almanacs was a leather-bound journal. He pulled it free. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "Sheriff brought it by last week. Said it was found outside town. Asked me to hold it till someone claimed it." Jonas flipped through the pages. His stomach turned. Names, dates, numbers, all written in a tight, efficient hand. Levi's hand. Maggie saw his face change. "What is it?" "It's a ledger," Jonas said slowly. "But not just any ledger. These are payoffs, bribes, payments to men in this town." He looked up. "This book could get people killed." Maggie's face hardened. "So why bring it here?" "Didn't know it was here," Jonas admitted. "But now that we do." Levi stood and pointed to a page. "Just one? A name? W. Granger. $50 monthly." Maggie paled. "Granger's the judge." Jonas nodded grimly. "And he ain't the only one?" The room grew quiet, tense. Maggie closed the book, placed it in a drawer. "Leave it here, I'll keep it safe." Jonas hesitated. "That's not your fight. You think it's yours." He looked at Levi, then back at her. "Don't know, but the boy brought it for a reason." That night back at the cabin, Jonas reached again for the flask. Uncorked it. The scent of cheap whiskey hit him like a slap. He looked at Levi asleep by the fire. The boy had crawled closer to the hearth that evening, as if trusting it wouldn't burn him. Jonas recorked the bottle, didn't drink. He set it on the windowsill and sat in the dark, listening to the wind. When dawn came, the cabin was quiet, too quiet. The ledger was gone. Jonas's hands trembled as he turned over the trunk, the drawer, every shelf, empty. He ran outside into the frostbitten air. Levi's boots were by the door, still there. So the boy hadn't left. But someone had been there. He saw it then, mud tracks near the window. A smear on the sill. The bottle lay shattered on the porch. And the fight was no longer just his. The first sign that something was wrong came with the silence. The kind of silence that doesn't settle, but smothers. Jonas returned from the ridge near sundown, the sky burning low over Ash Hollow, like a dying ember. His boots crunched across the frost-bitten ground. The door to his cabin swung open without a creak. Inside, the lamp still burned a bowl of half-eaten stew, congealed on the table. Levi was gone. The cabin wasn't disturbed. No broken windows, no kicked-in doors. But the absence screamed louder than any fight. Jonas stood still, breathing heavy. On the floor near the hearth lay the boy's battered boot, the laces still tied. He didn't need a tracker to tell him this was no runaway. Levi had been taken. Elias Snow smelled of tobacco and wet wool, a bounty hunter with more ghosts than friends. He found Jonas in the silver nickel fists, clenched around a bottle he hadn't touched yet. Jonas looked up the room, flickering in lamplight. "They took the boy," he said. Elias nodded slowly. "I heard. Judge Tabor's men, most likely. Word is they're cleaning up something that got sloppy." Jonas swallowed hard. What the hell does Tabor want with a kid? Snow tapped ash from his cigar. A message. Or maybe insurance. Either way, he don't let liabilities breathe long. Jonas shoved the bottle away. The gesture wasn't dramatic. It was tired, like a man refusing a handshake from the devil. Where Snow met his eyes. South Ridge. There's an old Methodist chapel burned during the war. Been empty since. They rode hard through the night. The prairie wind cut through their coats like knives. Snow led the way, a figure hunched in the saddle rifle strapped tight. Jonas rode behind, heart pounding like hoofbeats. And in his saddlebags, nestled under a bedroll, a single flask. More than once he reached for it. More than once he stopped. Each time he saw Levi's face. Not scared, not crying. Just waiting, like he always did. Waiting to see what kind of man Jonas would become. At a creek bed they stopped to rest the horses. Snow poured water into his hat for the mare. Jonas sat on a fallen log, hands shaking. "You look like hell," Snow muttered. Jonas nodded. "I deserve worse." Snow studied him. "You ever detox? In the middle of a rescue mission before no. You picked a hell of a time." Jonas laughed dry and bitter. "Kid deserves better than a drunk, breaking down mid-gunfight." Snow didn't argue. He just handed over a piece of jerky. "Chew on this, instead of your regrets." By dawn, they reached the old chapel. It stood crooked against the horizon roof, caved-in steeple, leaning like a drunkard. Crows circled above. Jonas crept to the edge of the ridge. Through the broken windows, he saw two men rifles slung lazy across their laps. One smoked when dozed, then in the back movement. Levi, hands bound, mouth gagged, seated on a cracked pew. He looked small in the stained glass gloom, but his eyes, those wolf eyes, were clear, focused. Jonas whispered, "He's alive." Snow cocked his rifle. "Not for long if we mess this up." They waited until the sun rose a little higher, enough to blind the guards from the east-facing windows. Then Jonas moved, through the brush, over the rotten fence, around the back. He kicked in the rear door with a crash. Snow fired through the front. One shot, two. The guards dropped, confusion frozen on their faces. Inside, Jonas rushed forward. One last man rose from behind the pulpit, gun half lifted. Jonas didn't think. He tackled him to the floor, fists flying. The man clawed for his sidearm. Jonas grabbed a shard of pew wood and slammed it across his jaw. Silence returned. Jonas turned to Levi. The boy blinked once. Jonas moved to untie him. You okay? He whispered. Levi nodded slowly. Just once. Jonas pressed a hand to the boy's cheek. I'm sorry. Levi didn't speak, but he leaned forward, just enough to let his forehead rest against Jonas's shoulder. It was more than enough. That night they camped by the creek. Snow stood watch. Jonas sat by the fire, flask in hand. His hands shook. He uncapped it. The whiskey smelled like memory, like comfort, like destruction. He looked at Levi curled in a blanket, face slack in sleep. Jonas threw the flask into the fire. The flames whooshed, swallowing it whole. The boy stirred, then stilled again. Jonas sat back, eyes on the stars. He was far from clean, far from whole. But for the first time he'd chosen the boy. And that had to be enough for now. Jonas had never thought silence could be so loud. The wooden chapel walls seemed to groan with the weight of the boy's presence. Levi sat near the altar legs, crossed back straight as a rifle barrel. For the first time since Jonas had known him, the boy spoke. My mother's name was Ruth, he said, voice low but steady. She used to sing while she swept, something about wild roses and red dirt. We lived behind the livery, in a room that smelled like old hay and soap. Jonas stood in the corner, still muddy from the trail, rain-washed and road-weary. Elias lingered outside, giving them space. The confession was not meant for strangers. She worked for Judge Tabor. Levi continued. Clerk cleaner and a keeper of secrets. She hid the black book, the one with names, bribes, shipments. She told me never to look, but she was scared. And when she drank, the truth spilled. Jonas's heart hammered. He wanted to speak to console, but something in Levi's tone kept him rooted. This wasn't a tale told for comfort. I was 6 when he came, Levi said. Tabor. Smelled like leather and money. He asked for the ledger. Mama said no. Told him she'd turn it into the marshal if he didn't stop. He smiled and kissed her hand, then left. Levi paused, swallowed hard. She was gone before sunrise. I found her lying there, her hair stained red, and I knew something terrible had happened. Jonas clenched his fists, knuckles whitening. I ran, hid in the alleys. That's when Rafe found me. One of Tabor's men. Said I owed a debt. Said I was family now. He made me learn numbers, how to write, tally, keep books, so I could replace her. Jonas felt his legs give. He sat on the chapel bench, like a felled tree. Tears hot and bitter welled in his eyes before he could stop them. Not just for Levi, but for the boy he had once left behind, the half-blood child of a native woman, hidden and forgotten in the haze of war. A mistake, a sin, a burden he'd never had the guts to claim. Why'd you cry? Levi asked, voice barely above a whisper. Because I was you, Jonas said, voice cracking. Once, long ago. The boy really turned to him now. Saw something human in the old man's eyes, something raw and broken. And I left someone, Jonas said. Left them because I thought it was the only way to live with what I'd done. I ain't proud of it. Been drinking myself dead for 20 years trying to forget. Levi said nothing, but he didn't look away. That night back at the cabin, Maggie came by with soup and bandages. She looked tired, hair damp under her bonnet, eyes wary. I know what he said, she told Jonas, when Levi had gone to sleep. About the ledger. About Tabor. Jonas poured coffee. Only coffee now. The bottle of rye sat untouched in the cabinet. He hadn't poured a drop since the ride to the chapel. Hadn't even thought to. I helped him, Maggie said softly. Years ago, he ran a clinic behind the courthouse. Said he wanted to keep the miners healthy, the girls safe. I believed him. Jonas looked at her, one brow lifting. Then one night, Maggie continued, a girl came in. Barely 12, broken arm. Said a man in a black coat pushed her down the stairs. Tabor was waiting. He took her home himself, told me to forget. She clenched her fists. I left the next morning. Never looked back. Jonas nodded. Slowly. We all got sins to bury. Not anymore, she said. We need to dig them up. In the following days, Jonas worked harder than he had in years. The roof got patched. The porch steps were re-nailed. The woodpile grew. He shaved, cooked. Even read a chapter from a dog-eared dime novel to Levi by lantern light. Each morning he thought of the whiskey. And each morning he didn't drink. Not because anyone told him to stop, but because Levi didn't ask. The boy simply watched, quiet, steady, unwavering. And Jonas, who had once outdrunk gunmen and outlasted regret, suddenly found himself wanting to be worthy of that gaze. He dug a hole behind the barn, buried the last 3 bottles under a stump. Out of sight, he muttered, wiping his brow. Out of reach. Elias came by once with news. Someone had broken into Maggie's clinic. Ledger gone. No sign of forced entry. Might have been an inside job, Elias said. Jonas nodded grimly. Doesn't change a thing. We still got the boy. And the truth, Maggie added, even if it's dangerous. That night, Jonas sat on the porch watching Levi feed the hens. He looked smaller than usual, bundled in an old duster. But his steps were sure. I aim to testify, Jonas said aloud. Levi turned. Tell them what you told me. Tell the whole damn town. The boy's eyes narrowed. They won't believe me. Jonas rose, joints cracking, but resolve unshaken. Maybe not. But they'll believe me. 'Cause I'm gonna stand beside you. And if Tabor comes for us, he'll find we ain't running. Levi didn't smile, but he didn't flinch either. Jonas felt the last chains of shame loosen just a little. He wasn't just hiding from his past anymore. He was walking toward it with the boy at his side. Ash Hollow had always lived in the shadow of its name. A hollow place, both in land and in soul. That morning, as the wind curled through its dusty alleys, carrying whispers and foreboding, something shifted. Something was coming, and even the dogs didn't bark. Jonas, Levi, Maggie, and Elias rode in together from the Western Trail. The townsfolk had seen comebacks before, men returning from saloons or debts, but this was different. Jonas sat tall in his saddle, his shoulders squared, his eyes sharp, like a man with nothing left to lose, but plenty to protect. Levi rode just behind him, calm, focused, clutching the satchel that held not just ink and paper, but memory, testimony, and blood. Maggie's jaw was set. She guided the mule steadily, her posture firm, unflinching. Elias rode with his rifle slung loosely, yet ready. He scanned rooftops, window shadows. The years had taught him to expect betrayal in daylight. People watched, curtains moved, words like ledger and witness fluttered on the breeze. The Gold Coach robbery had always been a myth, but the return of Jonas and the boy gave it weight, shape, a face. Jonas dismounted before the courthouse, his boots thudding against the steps with deliberate weight. Inside, the smell of oil lamp and mildew clung to every board. A clerk looked up. Startled, Quill paused mid-letter. "We need a hearing," Jonas said, voice low but unwavering. Sir, we can't. It concerns Judge Tabor." Jonas continued, pulling the ledger from Levi's satchel and placing it on the desk like a drawn pistol. "We have evidence." The clerk's face paled like paper. He's not here today. Then find someone who will listen." By noon, the town buzzed. Word traveled through the saloon to the blacksmith's forge, to the church steps. The former drunk Whitlow had returned. With the boy, with proof, and a storm. Deputy Ellison, no more than 25, and wearing his badge, like it still stung his chest, arrived outside where Maggie handed out copies of names from the ledger. He approached slowly, warily. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "What is this truth?" Maggie answered, "The kind you're not paid to ignore." He took a page. Read. His eyes moved left to right. Over names he recognized, arrests. He'd signed confessions that vanished. I need to check this." "You do that," she said. "Then ask yourself who benefits from silence." Sheriff Barrow showed up just before 1 o'clock, red-faced and breathing heavy. "You stirring up trouble again?" "Whitlow?" he asked, already defensive. Jonas stood at the foot of the courthouse steps, arms folded. "We're presenting evidence." "Of what?" Barrow sneered. "A drunk's ramblings. The word of a bastard child." Levi stepped forward, small, quiet, but his voice carried. "My name is Levi. My mother was murdered by Judge Tabor. I wrote down what he told me. I kept the book. I ran, because I wouldn't lie for him." Gasps, murmurs. A woman fainted near the edge of the crowd. Barrow's hand dropped to his holster out of instinct or fear. Elias, standing behind Maggie, took a single step forward. "Easy," he muttered. "Let the town hear." Jonas said, raising his voice now. Let them decide. A makeshift hearing began in the town square. No judge, no jury, just voices and eyes. Ellison stepped forward. In his hand, the original page from the ledger. I checked it. Cross-referenced with town records. Funds gone. Arrests missing. Writs erased. This isn't rumor. It's theft. Barrow barked, "Shut your mouth." Deputy Ellison didn't flinch. I won't. Not anymore. The crowd stirred. Tension hung like lightning about to strike. You'll lose your badge, Barrow growled. Then I'll pin it on my damn dog, Ellison snapped. Might get more justice that way. That night the town was divided by more than fences. In homes, families whispered. Some cursed Jonas. Others prayed for him. At the saloon, a glass was raised both in toast and threat. Someone burned a page of the ledger on the porch. At Maggie's cabin, Jonas sat by the hearth. Levi read aloud slowly from a Bible he'd found in the attic. Jonas listened, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of Tabor, of power that hides behind civility, of blood under courthouse floors. He looked to the coat rack. The old flask still hung there untouched. Temptation wasn't gone. It just no longer had command. Jonas stood, took the flask, unscrewed it, walked to the porch, and poured it out. A long stream. Into dirt, into history. Levi joined him. Jonas didn't speak. Didn't need to. They stood side by side and waited for the storm to break. The morning sun barely cut through the heavy mist that rolled over Ash Hollow. But the quiet didn't last. From the ridge beyond the creek, dust plumes stirred riders, 20 maybe more. Jonas Whitlow stood on his porch, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat, the rifle cradled in his arms, steady as a fence post. He didn't blink. They're coming, Levi said from behind him, voice low. Jonas didn't reply. He didn't need to. The boy saw it in his shoulders, tight as coiled wire. No whiskey on his breath, no tremor in his fingers, just steel. Behind them, Elias Snow cursed under his breath. Ain't seen numbers like that since Dodge. Jonas turned. Then you know what's coming. We hold the house, Elias said, spitting into the dirt. Hold the ridge. Buy time. Maybe a miracle. Maggie appeared in the doorway, a revolver holstered at her hip, and bandages tied neatly in a satchel. We've got 2 shotguns, your Winchester, Levi's small caliber, and half a box of dynamite left from the old well. Jonas looked at her, really looked, in the lines around her mouth, in the tightness of her jaw. This wasn't a healer. This was a survivor. I want the boy in the barn loft, Jonas said. He can see the field from up there. Elias and I take the porch. Maggie, if they breach, you take the kitchen, watch the back. No, Maggie said, firm. I stay close to Levi. He didn't argue. There was no time. Inside, they stripped down the house to bare necessities. Elias checked every window frame. Maggie loaded shells with fingers that never once trembled. Levi, quiet but alert, laid out maps, lined up lanterns. Jonas caught him tracing his finger across the ranch's edges, lips moving like a prayer. Jonas stopped beside him. You scared? Levi nodded slowly. Yeah. Good. Means you got something to lose. A long silence stretched between them. Jonas almost reached for the boy's shoulder. Almost. They want me, Levi said, not the ranch. They'll burn everything to get you, Jonas said, voice gravel thick. But we don't run. Out back, Elias found a rusted metal drum and stacked crates for makeshift cover. We light the field, he told Jonas, striking a match to show the wind's direction. Molotov line. Stop the horses at the fence. Jonas nodded. Then we fight him in the open. The barn was fortified with sacks of feed and broken wagons. In the kitchen, Maggie turned the table sideways, bracing it against the door. That night they didn't sleep. Jonas sat on the porch, rifle across his lap. He hadn't taken a drink in days, not since Levi poured out that last bottle. He'd hated the boy for it in that first moment, hated how exposed it made him feel. But now, in the hush before blood, he was grateful. He could feel everything, every breath, every heartbeat. In the quiet, Levi slipped beside him. You think we'll make it? The boy asked. Jonas didn't lie. Don't know. But we'll hold. Levi looked out over the fields. If I die, Will you tell the world who my mother was? Jonas looked at him then, at the face that held pain, resilience, and something older than both. You'll tell them yourself, he said. And as the first torch flickered in the distance, as the enemy's silhouettes lined the ridge like wolves, Jonas Whitlow stood not as a drunk, not as a broken man, but as a defender of what mattered: family, truth, redemption. And he wasn't backing down. Dawn came cloaked in fog and gunpowder. The first shots rang out before the sun fully crested the hills, echoing through the fields like the bell of judgment. Jonas crouched behind the barn's east wall, rifle in hand, his breath steady despite the storm. He had not touched a drop in days. His mind was sharp, no longer dulled by whiskey, but clear as broken glass. Tabar's men, no fewer than a dozen, fanned out from the tree line, dark figures moving in the mist like wolves. They came fast, but Jonas had prepared. The fencing was rigged with broken planks and tripwires, the windows barred, and the hatches secured. Positions, Jonas barked, voice firm. Elias was already on the second-floor landing of the farmhouse, Winchester leveled. Levi had been hidden in the root cellar beneath the woodpile, a dusty space, barely taller than a crouch. But the boy refused to cower. From a narrow slit in the floorboards, he passed up ammunition and supplies to Elias' hands, steady, eyes wide. Maggie, rifle in hand, guarded the back entrance. She wasn't trained like the others, but her eyes didn't waver. Her medical bag was slung over one shoulder, her pistol on the other. The shooting began in earnest. Bullets tore through wood and air. Smoke curled from muzzles, mixing with morning fog, until it became impossible to see where death might strike next. Jonas moved like a man with purpose, firing and reloading, with clockwork precision. Every time he saw Levi's small hands reach through the floorboards to offer another round, something in him steeled. He wasn't just defending a ranch, he was defending the boy who had saved him from himself. Suddenly Maggie called out. Behind the barn. They're flanking. Before Jonas could turn, one of Tabor's men emerged from the side rifle, raised eyes locked on the cellar. Levi didn't see him, Maggie did. With a cry, she leapt from her position and threw herself in front of Levi just as the shot rang out. No, Jonas roared, firing at the shooter and dropping him with a single shot. Levi scrambled from the cellar, tears streaking his face as he knelt beside Maggie. She was gasping, her fingers clutching his sleeve. Stay down, she whispered. You live, you hear me? Maggie. Jonas fell to his knees beside them, hands pressed to her wound, but it was too deep, too fast. I'm sorry, she whispered, her eyes locking with his. For everything. Then she was still. Jonas turned away, jaw clenched, rage and sorrow crashing through him. He rose and picked up his rifle, with a calmness more frightening than fury. From the window, Elias shouted. More coming from the west. Then the old man grunted and fell back, hit in the leg, then again in the side. Levi, defiant, despite the chaos, crawled up to him, pulling Elias behind cover, hands shaking but determined. Ellison, stationed by the south fence, took a hit to the shoulder, but continued firing, face pale, but teeth gritted. And Jonas, wounded in the upper arm, didn't stop. He pressed forward, commanding, firing, refusing to let grief root him in place. This wasn't just a skirmish, it was a reckoning. Jonas clutched Maggie's hand, her warmth fading fast. Everything around him blurred, the gunfire, the screams, except her breath, shallow and fleeting. Maggie's lips trembled. Her voice was a whisper, barely a breeze. That boy. He has to live. Don't let it be for nothing. Jonas bowed his head, voice cracking. I swear, I'll get him out. Another explosion shook the walls. The enemy had set the grain shed ablaze. Flames spread fast, crackling like bones beneath boot. Jonas? Levi's voice cut through the chaos, urgent and trembling. We have to go. Jonas didn't rise at first. He gazed at Maggie's face one last time, brushing a trembling hand across her forehead. Then he stood tall, taller than grief, taller than pain. He shoved the ledger into Levi's coat and buttoned it tight. You hold on to this, no matter what. A cry from the stables cut through the haze. Elias, wounded but still fighting. Jonas turned just in time to see the old bounty hunter dragging himself upright, one hand clutched to his soaked side, the other gripping his rifle. Jonas Elias snarled. "Get out of here, I got your back." Jonas met his eyes, fierce, tired, unyielding. "Thank you," he murmured. He grabbed Levi's hand and bolted through the back door. They ran across the rear yard fire, licking at the porch behind them. The cornstalks bowed low, in the wind like mourners. Bullets hissed past snapping branches, thudding into dirt. Jonas didn't stop. To the boy, to the oath. Behind them, Elias fell. His last breath ragged, but not wasted. He fired one final round. It caught a pursuer square in the chest, dropping him mid-charge. The farmhouse erupted in flames, roof collapsing in a storm of ash and embers. Fences caught fire. Smoke curled high into the sky, like a funeral pyre. Jonas and Levi made it to the tree line. Neither looked back, but they knew. Everything behind them was gone. Jonas didn't cry, didn't curse, but his shoulders, once solid as granite, shook under the weight of memory. Levi squeezed his hand tighter. "I'm okay," the boy said, voice trembling. Jonas nodded, though he didn't know if it was true. They didn't know what waited ahead. But in that moment, among fire, blood, and ruin, two souls still stood together. And that was enough to keep going. The gates of Fort Kearney yawned open, like a patient beast, waiting for its prey. Jonas rode in, body slumped forward, his left arm wrapped tightly around Levi. The scent of smoke still clung to them, the aftermath of flames that had devoured everything behind them. But they had made it. The town square buzzed with uneasy energy. Rumors spread faster than hoofs. Judge Tabor had arrived at dawn, flanked by his personal guards, unmarked uniforms, but heavily armed and merciless. He met with the sheriff and spun a false story. An old drunk delusional had kidnapped a child and assaulted officers of the law. Before Jonas and Levi could dismount, two officers approached. Mr. Jonas Whitlow. He didn't resist, only nodded, ashen-faced, jaw clenched. "You're under arrest for attempted murder and conspiracy against a judge." Levi opened his mouth, shocked, but Jonas's one arm tightened around him. "Let them do their job," he whispered. "Just stay close." They were hauled before an impromptu hearing at the courthouse steps. Tabor stood spotless, and stiff arrogance radiating from his posture. He stared at Jonas like a sick dog. This man, Tabor, proclaimed assaulted law enforcement, vandalized property, kidnapped a child, and now seeks to defame justice with his insane tale. Jonas lifted his head. "I struck at corruption." Tabor sneered. "Desperation speaks loud in fools." The sheriff stepped forward. "Sir, do we require a formal trial?" Tabor's tone was dismissive. "No trial necessary. The witness is here. He is rabid. Put him down." The crowd murmured. Suspicion shimmered in their eyes. Something was wrong. Suddenly, hoofs pounded from down the street. Deputy Ellison, his right arm heavily bandaged, face darkened by fatigue and rage. Behind him rode the local pastor, a man of solid integrity. Ellison dismounted, clutching a thick stack of documents. "Hold it right there," he shouted. All heads turned. Tabor's expression flickered. "You overstep, Ellison." Ellison slammed the papers before the sheriff's feet. "This is the ledger. The proof names payments, crimes. He's covered up. He's not the law. He's its executioner in disguise." The crowd gasped. The sheriff opened the binding, flipping through pages, his face drained of color. Jonas remained kneeling, eyes locked on Tabor. "It's over." Tabor drew his gun, but Ellison was faster. A single shot rang out. Tabor staggered, reeled backward, and collapsed on the courthouse steps. A profound silence fell. Dust hung in the air like ash. Ellison lowered his weapon, breathing hard. He was going to murder a man in daylight before a child. "I couldn't let that happen." The sheriff stayed silent. No orders were needed. The crowd stirred, quiet whispers bloomed into voices, then into shouts. Truth had broken dawn's gloom. Jonas slumped forward, utterly spent. But for the first time in a long while, a faint smile curved his lips. They had done it. The dust from Tabor's fall had barely settled when the courthouse bell rang 3 times, slow and solemn. It wasn't a signal of victory. It was the town calling itself to reckon. Jonas was taken inside, not in chains, but on a stretcher. Levi never left his side. Deputies moved quickly, collecting names from Ellison's ledger, verifying dates and connections. As the preacher swore upon the documents, whispers turned to gasps, then outrage. By noon, 5 of the most prominent men in Fort Kearny had been placed under arrest. A banker, a sheriff's cousin, 2 city councilmen, and a physician who had covered up more than medicine. They weren't dragged away, no. They walked with heads low, covered in the shame of knowing their faces had been carved into the mask of justice for too long. Levi stood in the town hall surrounded by townsfolk, his small hands gripping the ledger like a lifeline. When asked to speak, he didn't shout, he didn't plead, he simply read. And on March 18th, Tabor paid $500 to silence Mrs. Agnes Mullen regarding the disappearance of her sister. Entry marked handled. Silence. And on May 2nd, Tabor received $800 from Mr. Jacob Walsh in exchange for forgery of land deeds south of the Platte River. Murmurs turned to cries of disbelief. Jonas watched from a bench near the rear, his shoulder-bound right hand completely limp beneath the bandages, but his eyes burned bright. He wasn't the man who had crawled into a bottle years ago. That man died in the fire. This one sat tall despite the pain. The mayor, visibly shaken, stepped forward. Given the circumstances and the testimony of Levi, I declare the boy's status as a free citizen under protection of Fort Kearny's law. Furthermore, the property in Ash Hollow, formerly held in lien by Judge Tabor, is to be returned to its rightful occupant. A murmur spread. The preacher added solemnly, "By birth, the boy bears Tabor's blood. But by deed, by courage, and by truth, he bears Jonas's name." The townsfolk cheered not wildly, but with reverence, like a church after a long drought. Ellison approached Jonas later that day. "Wasn't sure we'd make it," he admitted. Jonas smiled, pain etched deep in his eyes. "I wasn't sure I'd ever want to." Levi stood nearby, watching. He didn't understand all the politics, but he understood one thing clearly: the man beside him had chosen to fight for him. Not out of guilt, but because it was right. That night, as the stars returned to the Nebraska sky, Levi sat beside Jonas, on the porch of a borrowed cabin. "They called me Whitlow today," he said quietly. Jonas looked at him. "You okay with that?" Levi nodded. "Yeah, I think it fits." Jonas said nothing. He didn't need to. The weeks after the reckoning passed in a hush, like the land itself was trying to heal. Ash Hollow was not the same. Its charred bones stood black against the prairie winds, but folks came back. First a carpenter, then a blacksmith, then the old widow who ran the bakery. No one spoke much, but they all knew something had shifted. Jonas returned too. The right side of his body was slow now. The bullet wound had severed tendons and nerves, beyond repair. He could no longer wield a hammer or swing a rifle, but he could speak, he could teach, and he could build something with words. So he did. The barn, half burned, but still standing, was cleaned out, its rafters patched, and its loft swept clear. With help from Ellison and the town preacher, Jonas opened the doors to a new kind of frontier. A classroom. 3 children came the first week. By the end of the month there were 12, boys and girls, sons of farmers, daughters of railroad workers. Even the town drunk's youngest. Jonas taught them to read, to write, to think. And Levi, he was the first to arrive each morning, and the last to leave. He never missed a day. Sometimes after lessons he'd help Jonas replant the fields, turning the ashen soil by hand. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. One day, while watching the kids play in the tall grass, Jonas turned to Levi. "You ever think about leaving?" Levi shook his head. "No. This place gave me a name, gave me a father." Jonas's eyes welled, but he only nodded. "Then let's make it a place worth staying." And they did. There was no statue for Maggie, but her name was carved into the doorframe of the barn, for those who gave their blood so children might grow. Elias's rifle hung above the chalkboard, unloaded, polished, a silent sentinel. The scars didn't fade. Not from the fire, not from the past, but something new took root. Not a legacy of violence, but one of voices. And under the wide Nebraska sky, lit by the steady glow of lanterns and the sound of laughter in the dusk, Jonas Whitlow passed on more than just letters and numbers. He passed on what he'd learned, far too late. That love once given can rebuild even ash. 3 years passed quietly, like a long breath drawn by the land. The prairie grass swayed golden again. Birds returned to their familiar perches. And Silver Hollow Ranch, once burned, once broken, stood proud against the wind. It was no longer just a farm. It had become something more. They called it a haven now, a place for those who had nowhere else to go. Children with no names, no past, no safe bed. They came in ones and twos, some on foot, some in wagons, a few led by desperate mothers who disappeared before dawn. At the center of it all was Levi. He was 17 now, taller, stronger, his voice deeper, eyes sharper, but still carrying the same quiet fire that had first drawn Jonas to him. He ran the day-to-day of the ranch with calm efficiency, organizing lessons, training the new hands, even negotiating with nearby merchants for supplies. To the younger kids, he was more than a brother. He was proof that a broken life could be mended. Jonas, now well into his 60s, moved slower. His right arm hung stiff at his side, and he often walked with a cane. But his presence was everywhere. He sat on the porch during the evenings, carving little animals out of wood, telling stories that started with back before the war. Or, Elias once said, he had become the soul of the ranch. Ellison visited often. He had traded the badge of a deputy for that of a sheriff. The townsfolk trusted him now, and he used that trust with care. He never carried a shotgun into the ranch, only books, letters from new arrivals, and once a dog for the kids. The barn was larger now, rebuilt with sturdy beams and wide windows. The words above its door still read, "For those who gave their blood, so children might grow." There were 15 kids at Silver Hollow that summer. The days were filled with chores and games, arguments and apologies, shared bread and secret plans carved into tree trunks. They called the place a school, but it was more than that. It was home. One warm evening, as fireflies blinked over the fence posts, Levi sat beside Jonas on the porch, much like he had years ago. Jonas, half asleep in his rocking chair, let the last rays of sun warm his face. "You ever wonder why they keep coming?" Levi asked. Jonas opened one eye. "Because they know someone's waiting." That night, as the lamps dimmed and the children fell into sleep, a knock came at the gate. It was soft, hesitant. 2 quick taps, then silence. Levi opened the door. On the porch stood a boy, no older than 10, barefoot, thin as a rail, his face streaked with dust, his eyes wide and scared. Behind him, nothing but the empty dark. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Levi stepped forward just enough to see the trembling in the boy's hands. Then he crouched down, smiled gently, and said the same words once spoken to him so many years ago, under a stormy sky. "Come in, son. You're safe here." The boy blinked, lips parting. And then, for the first time in what may have been months, he stepped forward, into light, into warmth, into Silver Hollow. The river of time had carried pain and fire, but it had remembered. And now it gave back. The story? The River Remembers is not just a Western epic. It's a mirror reflecting deeply relevant truths for modern life. In today's fast-paced, uncertain world, it reminds us that healing doesn't mean erasing the past, but using it to plant seeds for the future. Jonas, a man once lost in guilt and alcohol, didn't change through magic. He changed because of one quiet gaze, one small hand reaching out to be saved. In our modern lives, we often lose connection with ourselves and others amid the rush. But sometimes all it takes is a single pause to truly see someone, to extend a hand to our own version of Levi, to begin a journey of transformation. Levi's final words, "Come in, son. You're safe here," aren't just a welcome. They're a declaration that we too can become a safe haven for others, even if we ourselves have once been broken. The message is simple, yet profound. Quiet kindness, steady resolve, and unconditional love still have the power to resurrect even the most scorched parts of our hearts.